Welcome to Real Talk in ELT, a podcast that talks about the reality of teaching English.
And welcome back to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. This is going to be part of the summaries and side notes series, kind of following my CPD throughout the year. So I recently was able to sit for a webinar and a chat. So there's a really cool organization, a couple of friendly faces that you've seen on the podcast before have developed with other professionals a group called Conversations about BELF. It's very cool. They have lots of really interesting speakers that come on, and the whole dynamic is the webinar speakers, they give a presentation, and then afterwards you have a chance to chat with people from business English teachers from kind of around the world. So it's nice. It's just kind of like a nice collaborative chat and sharing of information. So I've promised myself that I'm going to participate in many more of these. That being said, I got a chance to listen to Lucas Peltonen. I think that's his name. I apologize if I say that wrong. I was actually late to this webinar because I was doing other stuff. So he did start the webinar with a anecdote for his presentation, which was called Building Lingua Cultural Competence into a BE, a Business English textbook. And I missed it. All I know it was about a chicken, and I didn't get to hear it. But I'm going to try and reach out to Lucas to see if he might want to come on the podcast and kind of explain this. Even though I'm doing a summary and adding some side notes about it, perhaps he would be willing to come on and dig a little bit more in depth and explain his research. So what he is doing, he works out of, hold on, let me see if I can get the actual, again, unprepared. The Hong Kong Polytech University, I believe that's where, again, I missed the beginning of the thing, but I believe that's where he's working out of. He's a PhD student, he's doing research, and this is part of his research process. So he takes kind of like the theory and he's structuring it a little bit and trying to put it into practice. And that was the goal of his session. So he started off by defining business English as a lingua franca. Now, he gave his definition, and you will find commonly, this is a side note, commonly that this is not well defined as of yet, meaning that many professionals still kind of have their own perception of BELF, and so sometimes it kind of gets a little muddled. So he clarified his position, which I think was a good idea, which is a shared language used in the business domain by speakers with different mother tongues, and he quoted Du, Babcock, and Yao from their 2020. I apologize, it's noisy on the street. They're doing construction, there's like animals, it's a whole mess today. So let's pray that it's not too loud outside and I don't have to re-record this. And then he went into defining what lingua culture is, and it's the meeting point of language and culture. I think it's a small child outside. I apologize. So I think it's interesting because that's like kind of the focus of his PhD research and everything that he's doing now is kind of finding the point of language and culture and how those collide and how we can exploit those in business English textbooks and things like that. Then he went on to define Lingua Cultural Competency, which is having a baseline of knowledge of business English terms in terms of language, so kind of like the knowledge of the terms. Processing skills to adjust to communication with those of different linguocultural backgrounds, and having strategies to negotiate meaning in changing circumstances. So for him, lingua cultural competency is pretty much broken down into knowledge, skills, and strategies. And that's one of the things that he's trying to integrate into the business English textbooks. And really what he did was there was a lot, he gave his context kind of like of English in the world today and what English as a global lingua franca looks like, et cetera, et cetera. He also went into the context of business English in China, because that's where he is, and so that is his current context. He gave lots of really good statistics and information about that, so we could kind of understand where he was coming from in his research. But then he kind of said, okay, so this is what he did for his study, his specific study. He wanted to develop conceptual framework from the research. He wanted to create criteria or can-dos from the research framework, put quantitative and qualitative analysis and evaluation according to the criteria, and he was using market leader for this specific, for his study. He gave some reasons why, and they're valid reasons why, which I think I have the reasons that he gave, but he's going to adapt market leader based on the materials and materials analysis and evaluation that he's doing. Yes, so why he chose market leader, because market leader is kind of a common one that most business English teachers are at least familiar with. If you don't use it, or if you haven't used it in the past, you at least know that it exists. He said that his reasons for choosing that was it's largely aimed at active, job-experienced business professionals, and because the focus of his study was working with individuals that have job experience, then it was the most appropriate. According to Rose and Galloway's 2019 Global Englishes for Learning, or for Language Teaching, framework, the GELT framework, within his research functions as well, it ranked by far the highest in global orientation. So when we do like analysis of course books and looking at what if they're including global perspectives, etc. Yeah, and he has extensive experience with it, so he was comfortable with using material. So what he did was he created he created kind of the Lingua Cultural Competency framework, and it looks like pretty much like concentric circles. So the outer circle is the BELF theory, which is used to illustrate characteristics of international business communication as well as describing the context. Then the circle smaller in the concentric circles would be the Lingua Cultural theory, which provides understanding for how language and culture intermix, and each informing the other rather than two separate entities. And then within that, the smallest circle in the concentric circles is genre theory, which defines and structures the communication that must be known to BELF speakers functioning within cultures of business. So the way that he described this as he built this framework was that BELF theory is kind of like the sport. He used the sport of football, soccer, however you want to say. So that's the sport. Lingua cultural theory is like a very specific game, and genre theory is the rules of the game. So if you want to kind of contextualize that a little bit, that's how he was structuring his framework, so that he could support his investigation into the materials. So then from there, so he's built this framework of theories. He created criteria derived from that framework. So he's got the BELF theory, lingua cultural theory, and then smaller genre theory. And then from there, he built up 22 criteria derived from that framework. And the criteria, I can read a couple to you so you can have kind of an idea. Professionals, these are kind of like the can-do statements. Professionals understand cultural dimensions and how they can be beneficial to lingual cultural competency. Professionals understand and can identify specific behaviors likely attributable to lingual culture, etc., etc. So these are just 22 can-do statements. So he performed some interviews as a needs analysis across varying industries, varying job titles in terms of hierarchical structures, varying sizes of companies the students work at, varying levels of experience. I think from the chart here, there's up to, from 2 or 3 years experience up to 30 years experience. Most of them, with the exception of two, from the statistics that he was showing us are from China. Then there is one interviewee from Malaysia and the other one from the United States. And so he put together needs analysis interviews as a needs analysis, and what he realized after having these conversations, he gave us some anecdotal quotes from these conversations with the students, was that there were some criteria from the theories, from the framework that he developed that were appropriate. There was one that he removed because it didn't seem to appear in any of the interviews. And then there was four more that were introduced, four more criteria that were introduced that were brought up in the interviews that wasn't in the theory literature. So it became kind of a Frankenstein of incorporated criteria. So then once he has, developed, okay, this is the criteria. If we're looking at Lingua Cultural Competency, these are the 22 criteria that he found to be applicable. And then he went to the course book. And from the course book, I know this is a little dry, but it's like the background of the conversations and the side notes that I wanted to talk about. So then he went to the market leader. There's 10 units, 4 working across culture units, and 4 revisions, which equated to 128 sections. He had the 22 criteria from the framework that he developed from the interviews and from analysis. So he had, the 22 criteria that he was looking for, and that resulted in 2,816 data points, each a potential opportunity to develop a lingua cultural competency. So every time that there's an activity or a task or something to do in the book, that is one possibility that the book could develop one of the criteria for lingua cultural competencies. Okay, so then he did identify that there are 31 genres in the book, which included 13 new genres, because during the analysis it was like something that wasn't fitting into the 31 genres that he found. And then he gave us a bunch of statistics about it. So what he found was the unit on culture was unit 7, happened to be unit 7 in the book that he used. It had the most opportunities because it was obviously the unit on culture. So then, of course, they were really exploiting the lingua cultural competencies. And unit 9 had the highest proportion of missed opportunities. So it didn't really exploit the material as much as it could have done. So again, bunch of statistics. I'm not going to go through all of them. So then what he did was he said, well, okay, so I've identified the possible points where in this chapter 9, where the materials could be adapted, supplemented, or developed. And then he created this really cool decision-making tree. I'm not going to share it because I want his permission first. And I just wanted to get him on the podcast. But so the top line approach is that we're looking not at general English, but we're looking at specific proficiency because Business English is part of ESP. And then he talks about four different adaptation strategies, and these are the 4 that he used. And he said by no means this is an extensive or exhaustive list. These are the 4 that he used. So personalizing, localizing, modernizing, or globalizing. And globalizing is when we take local knowledge and expand it out to a global or a broader context, because that was a relatively new term for some of the people that were participating in the meeting. Then once you decide, okay, so let me make it easy. Imagine you're looking at a book and you see an activity and you say, this is not really exploiting all of the conversations about how like language and culture have these really cool, this cool dynamic. So what can I do to change this activity? Well, you could personalize it, you could localize it, meaning let's bring it down from a global level and put it into the context that our students are living and working in. We could modernize it, maybe it's a little out of date, so like what's something that we could change possibly bringing in new materials or something like that, modernizing it, like how does it look today? Or we could localize it, meaning this is what it looks like at a local level. How would it look if we expanded that out on a broader level? So those are the adaptation strategies that he was working with. And then from there was adaptation categories and examples. Again, I'm not going to share the thing, but there was quite a few things that you could do. So you could add or omit. So you could do things like role plays, simulations, case studies, problem-based tasks, strategy charts, etc. You could change the format, so change the photos, change the articles, change the dynamic from group to individual, change the genre introduction, so you could change, kind of the general genre that they were talking about. You could introduce authentic materials, news media, reports, etc. You could use learner-generated materials, so work, product, reflection, presentations, etc. You could use online resources, company websites, videos, blogs, etc. Or you could dive into the language corpora using specific jargon or frequencies. So again, these are just, you see something and the activity or the task isn't really exploiting the material as well as it could be doing. And so these are some of the adaptation strategies and categories and examples that you could do to use the printed material in a better way. So he did give us a couple examples. One of the examples was modernizing it using authentic materials, and he chose to use news media. So there was an article, and there was this article that was talking about, what was it? Hang on. Okay, it was talking about the trade markets between China and the US, and there was this one quote in there that said, quoting directly from the book, China has also said the fact that Americans save much less of their incomes than the Chinese do has increased the trade deficit. And so this specific quote, it's really talking about, okay, well, let's talk about, what is the culture behind savings between Americans and the Chinese, etc. His comment was professionals can discern, this was the criteria that he applied to it, professionals can discern between visible culture, meaning the external, and deep culture, which is the internal values, norms, and assumptions, and can express both. So he wanted to exploit that criteria point, and he changed it to a more contemporary article from December of 2022. He got it from, where did he get it from? Sorry, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know the source of this. I think it's something with the EU. I can't put, I screenshot it, but I don't know exactly where I found. Anyways, he found an online article, and to replace the reading that was there, and he wanted to include a discussion and comprehension questions, can begin from this article because it's the original article, and then kind of building out from there. It's an excerpt because the article explicitly discusses trade agreements connecting to principles that are embedded in the EU Lingua Cultural Patterns. Again, so he just changed it for something that's more modern, updated, and that he could develop discussion and comprehension questions that would really exploit that one criteria because it was a missed opportunity. The next one was that there was a listening, and the listening was training for negotiating. The whole unit was about negotiation, and the listening was listening to like he's a partner of the GAP partnership, so he's an expert on negotiating. And there was some questions here, and the listening. Let me just read it. Okay, it says, listen to the final part and answer the questions. What behaviors are appropriate for a good negotiator? How do you tell if there's more scope for negotiation. So these are kind of specific information. So they're listening for specific information because they had done a previous listening where they're filling in the gaps. And then just discussion questions. What do you think makes a really good negotiator? Do you prefer high conflict win-lose negotiations or cooperative win-win negotiations? How common is negotiating in your country? The last question, how common is negotiating in your country, is what he flagged as something that could be exploited. And what he wanted to do was localize it a little bit more with learner-generated materials, and he wanted the learners to do a reflection. Because the criteria point that he applied here was professionals understand and can identify specific behaviors likely attributable to lingua cultura. Here's the thing. Listen, he's doing a PhD. His research is phenomenal. The way that Lucas has described this and everything. Some of these things though, when we break it down and we actually go into the language classroom, and this was the discussion that I had with some of the people in my group, was that we sometimes meet resistance, which is challenging. So the resistance that we can have, and I was actually discussing this with a woman, Katrine. She's in Germany. She is German, and she is in company training. She's been working for 20 years. Myself, who's been living and working as an ELT professional for the past 12 years in Brazil. And the other teacher that was there was a university professor, Ling, and she is from Malaysia and she's working in a university. And the conversation that we got into was Lucas created an amazing, kind of very visual, something that you can follow along. Okay, so here's some criteria. Let me analyze the materials and let me look at it and see, this is not really exploiting the language and the lingual cultural aspects as much as I would want it to. So, and then he gave this really great flow chart of okay, so here are some aspects that you can look into or adaptations that you can make with a lot of examples. Excellent. However, this is where it comes into play. So this is where we would actually need to know our students. We would need to know the current context in which we teach, and we would need to know the flexibility or inflexibility that the current institution that we're working with has. Because, for example, this specific adaptation that he chose to do was to have them reflect on he said here, hang on, the reflection can be discussed or written. You could add a number 4 with the prompts. If it's common, remember the question was, how common is negotiating in your country? So he wanted to add, if common, how do you communicate with those from non-negotiating cultures? If it's not common, how do you communicate with those from negotiating cultures? Meaning, let's just throw Americans under the bus here because I'm American, I feel like I can. But, so Americans, they love negotiate. I don't know, we think we're negotiators, I don't know why. But, and it's usually a very, competitive. The American market is a very competitive and kind of, it goes at breakneck speeds. And so the people do really, it's American business people tend to, huge generalization here, by the way, American business people tend to pride themselves on being good negotiators. And so if we look at that and we look at another culture that maybe doesn't have this pride in winning a negotiation or something along those lines, how would those people interact and how would they actually get something done without one person being steamrolled, etc. Now this is great as a reflection, and I think that some of the students that I currently teach or that I've taught in the past would be able to reflect on that. However, I don't think many of them would, because in Brazil, my current teaching context in Brazil is that companies usually demand that their employees have quote unquote fluent English or advanced English. Now, companies are not really good at evaluating because it's either the human resources person or it is the manager, the manager or the boss of whoever's being hired gives an interview in English And that person has absolutely, in most cases, I don't want to say always, but usually has no training in how to evaluate and assess English levels. Here in Brazil, there is still a huge stigma. Even if the person has extremely high fluency, the general population in business, if you have an accent, accent plays a huge role in whether or not they think you are fluent or not. So you can have the most articulate answer to a question, or you can describe in great detail perfectly how you would resolve a workplace conflict or problem. And if you have a slight Brazilian accent, the human resources people or the person within the company is just going to say, oh yeah, no, their English is not that good. So that's the current context that I work in. And most people do not have any interaction, even at the managerial level, with outsiders. So they speak or relatively well in English. They have decent, I would say, between B1 and B2 levels. Most people who are working in business, at least at managerial levels, B1, B2 levels. However, they don't have a lot of interaction. And that's not until you reach like director, vice president levels, that type of, once you're at that level, like the more executives, not managerial, but more executive level is when you start really putting into practice your English. So even if I have a manager, chances are maybe 2 or 3 times a year, they have to present results. That's it. So this type of substitution of reflecting on that it's not going to be super rich with my type of students in my context, because the current context is they actually really don't have a lot to reflect on, because they don't have a lot of information, because they don't really interact with a lot of people. They can see things as an observer, and we can bring things into the classroom, and we can try to raise their awareness about tendencies or practices through articles or analysis or videos or listenings or things like that. However, really they don't have a lot of practical knowledge. So a reflection wouldn't be super productive for them, because they just really don't have a lot to contribute unless it comes like it's like a teacher-fed information. The other thing that Ling was saying, and she's over in Malaysia, was that her current university, the module that they make for the business English students is primarily based on grammar, which is frustrating for her. And what she had said was that the actual teachers, when she's tried to do some sort of like introduction into like lingua cultural aspects or reflections or things like that, her fellow teachers would say, well, what's the point of that? Why would you do that? So there's some resistance even from the teachers who don't see it as something that would be really, really positive for their practice. They want their students to, be grammatically sound and use all the proper vocabulary, but they're really not taking into consideration how the language that they're using and their cultural influence of the language that they're using is affecting their negotiations, is affecting their interactions with colleagues or clients or suppliers, etc. And then Katrine also came from the German perspective, where a lot of Germans have a very high level of proficiency within the companies, because in that culture, from her experience, that there's a lot of training and early education into English, and so people typically have higher proficiencies. But then what happens is, and the German culture has been stereotyped to the maximum as being cold and not very, warm and welcoming and interactive, and they're very straight and direct and to the point. And, how would this be introduced, but she said that most people are open to it. open to like looking at these students, but that perhaps the teachers might lag behind in the teachers' awareness of the impact of lingua cultural aspects. We kind of summed up our chat, and it was very interesting to kind of see like the three different perspectives from Germany, Malaysia, and Brazil. And what I realized was, and Ling from Malaysia was saying that she had something similar, or she felt something similar, was that a lot of my students don't want to tackle these types of skills, competencies, until after they feel that they're quote unquote fluent or proficient based on the 8 traditional like listening, reading, speaking, writing, grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. I'll put the 7. They don't really care about genre or discourse or anything like that. But once they feel that they've maxed out on their proficiency on those 7 skills and systems, then they'll look at it. So lingua cultural competencies are really looked at, or the perspective, at least that I feel, not necessarily with my clients, because I demand that they accept this and that it's definitely going to help them in building better relationships and just being a more successful business professional, is that I need to be proficient in the language first, and then I'll look at lingua cultural competencies, which is, it has to be something that it happens along the way. So yes. Okay. Back to Lucas. That was a long side note. Anyways, he gave a couple more, especially about, the last one in the unit was about negotiating, and there was hold on. It was like a, kind of like a task to build rapport and kind of put some things into categories, and anyways, and he decided that he wanted to personalize it, and he wanted to give them some strategy charts, because some of his, the criteria that he was focusing on was professionals can function within interpersonal genres for building rapport and making small talk for business purposes. And this is actually something that people overlook. Like, they're so concerned about the terminology and the grammar. It's like, in business, having good rapport, being able to make small talk and develop relationships is like half of the battle. So he came up with some strategy charts for his students about like basic small talk and like how to broach the situation of family if they wanted to talk about family, and finding common interest or etc. So he kind of gave these little flow charts to his students, and they felt as if that helped them. And then he gave them a speaking task based on that. And so they were trying to practice building rapport and, that kind of push and pull dynamic of seeing like how much is this person willing to divulge of their family and personal life, so that we can kind of make a connection, we develop rapport with each other, and just kind of that dynamic. So it was interesting, and that's what he proposed. There was another one too. This is going to be a really long podcast. I apologize. Okay. Anyways, he went through key takeaways and next steps. Which was interesting. I really just liked how he came up with, it kind of went through like theory frameworks and then like into practice. It made a lot of sense, like how he developed this and why he was doing it. And he's still working on it. So hopefully I can try and get him on the podcast to have a chat about it, because it's really actually quite interesting. And I think it goes beyond business English. He's doing it specifically because he's working in a business English context, but I think that this is like really something that is going to kind of touch on those ideas of inclusion and etc. So he gave a bunch of references and some discussion questions, and then we went off into breakout rooms, and that's when I had the great discussion with Katrine and Ling. And so if anybody is a business English teacher, or the conversations that are happening there are about English as a business lingua franca, and so the main ideas are always about BELF. But I think other teachers would benefit, because you can see, even from this was only focused on business English, but you can see how this would then translates into other contexts if you're, willing to connect those dots. So, couple things. I'll try to get Lucas on because he was fabulous. 2, it was a great talk, and I highly recommend people joining the conversations about BELF. They have an Instagram site or Instagram profile, and they have a website where you can sign up for the discussions. I think they're about, frequency is about once a month. And so I liked his charts, and I'm going to see if I can try to take some of his theory and his frameworks that he's built and apply it with my learners, and see just test it out, do some action research with it, and see how it would adapt here in Brazil. Again, I think the idea is really good as an overarching idea. However, I think some of the adaptation strategies might have to be managed depending on your current teaching context, depending obviously on learners, institutional standards, things like that. So the idea is really good. I loved it. I'm going to play with it. I think it's fantastic. But then at the same time, I think that there also is some concessions that have to be made depending on where you're teaching. So hopefully we can get Lucas on and we can have a chat about it. And that's it for summaries and side notes, as part of my CPD. And I will see you guys for a new episode soon, hopefully. All right, take care.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk in ELT. Want to join the conversation? Head on over to Instagram at Kelly Pennington ELT and send me a message. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube or Spotify channel to stay up to date, and of course, take care of yourself, your health, your vibe, and your tribe. Until next time.